Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to today's edition of HFY, where I take old stories I've narrated and update them to modern audio standards. This particular story is called An Empty Universe, written by Grace. In a long history of the universe, there were a great many forms of life that had evolved. Admittedly, life was a somewhat ambiguous term, especially when semi-self-propagating protocells are concerned. Nonetheless, life in the great and expanding universe has always been incredibly rare, relative to any single planet, but incredibly common when considered in the universe as a whole. Anything that happened in excess of a few billion times could not truly be considered rare, even if considered over the course of billions of years. And somewhere in the ballpark of 2.5 trillion planets, at least at this current point in history, as the number of planets has occasionally contracted and then massively expanded over time. Most of the time, life never got past what you might call the early stages of development. The proverbial script never got on the page, so to say, and the life in question tended to peter out before it even got a particularly good cellular stage going. A few proteins, a few building blocks, maybe even a few cellular components that seemed to work in concert in a simplistic mimicry and what life would eventually be. But nearly always it ended there, due to radiation, pressure, limited chemicals, or any number of other complicated factors. Often life appeared, creating a few offspring of sorts, and then they all died off the same day, only to arise again that same planet, planetoid, or drastically more infrequently space junk like comet, meteor, or the like. Still, it happened, and in fact happened on some planets rather often. Over the course of many millions of years, it seemed that, if the exact right circumstances were found, life was determined to occur, if at all possible. So, despite the relative apparent rarity of life in the universe as a whole, life itself is actually rather common. In the long history of the universe, intelligent life is at least not so rare as to be worth all the fuss philosophers and the clergy might put on it, though it is a great deal rarer than life in general. Sure, it's impressive and rare and majestic in the eyes of poets and those who would use the word majestic unironically, but more often than not, life on a planet gets sort of stuck at a certain stage. Maybe it's the environment, maybe it's evolution, maybe that life form never evolved the unified control board sort of system, and therefore had nothing that could easily coalesce into a brain and consciousness in that way that intelligent life, at least so far in the universe, has required. That's not to say that life as a lesser intelligence was particularly uncommon. It wasn't unusual to get clever creatures who were capable of problem-solving to a minor degree. But the consciousness, awareness, sense of self and others that is generally accepted to be intelligent life was somewhat both a great deal less common than might be hoped for, and a great deal more common than philosophers staring at the stars in melancholic despair generally feared. Simply put, intelligent life is rare, but it's rather a large universe out there, so rarity isn't such a big deal as the poets and fearful folks writing about the stars might have you believe. It happens from time to time, but like the protocells, is rarely capable of holding out and becoming something greater and grander. Usually, or more accurately, nearly always, intelligent life never goes beyond the early stages of development. In the long, laborious, ancient, and long-winded history of the universe, however, some things are rare. Some milestones of sort are rare enough that they are worth noting, studying, and understanding. In fact, at somewhere in the neighborhood of 14 billion years of universal existence, there were only 9 species that had achieved faster-than-light travel on their own. Out of the many trillions of planets that had existed, only 9 ever supported a life form that became capable of spaceflight and leaving their own solar system, and eventually mastering faster-than-light travel. The first 7 happened independently, separated from one another in time. Their experience and existence within the firmament of creation was a relative blip, and each species' existence far apart, both spatially and temporally. Each species rose up, mastering the science and technology that would follow FTL travel, and scoured the space first near their own star, or stars, considering that 2 of these species had arisen from binary star systems, for a generation or so. Then, curious to discover the rest of the galaxy, they would head out to the next nearest star, and perhaps even consider venturing to more and more stars over time, where they hoped to find planets capable of supporting complex organic life, and maybe even meeting someone else in the great cold universe that was also intelligent, and maybe even spacefaring. Usually, they gave up there. They didn't generally try to escape the galaxy, though again, interestingly, the same 2 who were birthed in binary star systems even managed to venture outside their home galaxies and spread throughout the universe. And after a time period that to them seemed interminably long, and to the universe was barely even the tiniest briefest blip, they passed out of existence, whether by transcending to a virtual world, giving up and committing mass suicide, succumbing to some great or horrifying chasmalistic disaster, or simply slowly petering out and letting the uncaring, cold universe take them. These were the things that impacted the first 7 species to become capable of FTL travel, though some did find intelligent life. They never found life similar enough to themselves that they cared much to interact, and none of intelligent life they found was ever themselves able to rise up to the point where they could escape their planets, their stars, or the boundaries around the speed of light itself, which is generally the necessary hurdle to overcome in order to become a true spacefaring race. Certainly stasis or something similar works, but until you can collapse space-time or dive at will somehow through it, in the case of a few species, your journeys within the universe will be necessarily short-lived. Particularly costly. It seems a law of nature that highly intelligent races do not do well with long, temporally confusing waits in stasis, for some unknown reason. Then came the 8th race to reach FTL travel. They managed an impressive feat of FTL travel in roughly 13.8 billion years into existence of their universe, and they called themselves humanity. Humanity did nearly everything that would have been expected if there had been an entity left to have overseen their existence, and therefore had expectations to begin with. There was not, tragically, any such being, and therefore nothing managed to get even the littlest bit of amusement or joy from watching afar as the humans cheered and celebrated and jumped around when their first ship reached their next nearest star. This was, cosmically speaking, rather a shame, considering how thoroughly endearing the little event had been. Practically an entire planet cheering and dancing about and high-fiving, which interestingly enough is another seemingly universal gesture of all highly intelligent species, for reasons that may never be known. Then the humans deviated from expectation, though that word has much less meaning when considered against the lack of beings with expectations to begin with. Nonetheless, while each of the other 7 prior species to achieve FTL travel had headed to their nearest star, then eventually, between 0.8 and 2.7 generations of whichever species was in question, chose to continue onward to the next star, humanity did not. Instead, humanity headed out towards every nearby star with even the remotest chance of containing life, or something worthy of study. And they headed out in a fashion that could be charitably described as slapdash, barely waiting for slow-moving signals from their crews at their nearest star to reach back to Earth, before beginning new vessels. While their first ship to bend the laws of space and time had been a monument to engineering, precision, and ingenuity. The next wave that flew out were a more diverse mix of quality, from similarly fine and impressive ships, all the way down to those that were unlikely to traverse safely at walking pace, much less several times the supposed highest possible speeds without cheating the system and the universe. Each species before humanity had spread out slowly, then faster and faster as their technology improved and the fears were erased. They had found, eventually, life of a single-cell form and then spread and searched themselves all with robots for new life until they discovered something that was near, or at least approximately near, being intelligent, which was always a bit of a letdown. After all, by this point, they would have spent lifetimes and lifetimes in space searching, and they inevitably found species whose intelligence was capable of perhaps some sort of awe and shock at finding out they weren't alone in the universe. But so far, no species had come across anyone who was actually capable of understanding the concept of the universe on its own yet. Thus the search would continue seemingly in vain, and while there might be hopeful, extremely rare planets where intelligence seemed likely, they were never particularly advanced, and certainly not capable of being understood, or given their own understanding back in a meaningful way. Humanity, however, spread out like a plague of very excited toddlers when released to the universe. Toddlers, it should be said, that were proverbially unleashed in a galaxy composed entirely of far-flung cotton candy and soft toys with bright lights and exciting sounds. Simply put, humanity set off with a level of passion, excitement, and hope that was quite literally unique in the entire 13.8 billion year history of the universe. They set off at random with delight and anticipation, and a great many more dreams of meeting aliens and becoming friends with them than any species prior to humanity had ever managed. And they were badly disappointed. But it took less than 2 human generations to find any life out there in the universe, generation being defined generally as the mean age of offspring rearing, which at this point in human history was around 28 years. It was far too long of a wait for human patience. Before the first generation of searching was over, many humans had fallen into despair and concluded the universe was empty and alone, and had decided the search was not worth the effort. Others, seeing the problem more as a logistical issue than a question of depressing likelihoods and tragic universal loneliness, decided to begin crafting ships that could search for life autonomously, something no previous spacefaring species had begun to build for far, far longer in their search. Again, humanity was impatient, and as a result, ahead of the curve. With these ships and the eventual knowledge of life existing in at least some form on several other planets, humanity set out to escape their galaxy. They reasoned, perhaps a bit illogically, that if they could leave their galaxy, they should leave their galaxy, if only to prove that they were capable of doing so. And thus, with tens of thousands of autonomous ships searching every star system they knew of for life, they began the process of sending themselves and their search ships out of their galaxy as well, and into the universe more broadly. To avoid spending ages covering what can charitably be described as a very long search with depressingly few results, let it be said that humanity was persistent. Yes, many had given up on the search for others in the empty void of space, but that did not matter. Humanity was not made up of only those who doubted, but also those that believed, and believed with a passion. And with an advancing technology, passion, and a certainty of belief that they would find others out in the empty void of space, they pushed forward until they broke not only out of their own galaxy, but out of the galactic cluster nearest to them as a whole, crossing seemingly infinite space and, like a disease of curiosity and exploration, humanity crossed the universe in its search, with more curiosity, passion, drive, and hope than the entire combined species that had come before it. Sadly, this did very, very little. The next species to achieve FTL travel on their own would not arise for roughly 0.2 billion years, which was still several million human generations away. This left humanity alone in the universe, in a way no previous species had fully comprehended. This was not the loneliness of thinking that you might be the only spacefaring race within your galaxy, but rather the near certainty that you were the only spacefaring race in all of creation as a whole. Even discoveries of ruins so ancient that they were nearly impossible to comprehend, showing that there had been other species to reach the stars in the past, did nothing to help humanity. It showed them only that space was not the greatest foe they faced, but time. Of course, by now most humans could live near indefinitely, barring accidents or tragedy or suicide. But being theoretically capable of enduring a few 100 million years of waiting, especially when you wouldn't know just how long the wait might be, and actually be capable of waiting that long were very, very different. And so, humanity cheated. They cheated unfairly in the great game that is the universe. They stopped waiting altogether. They found those few rare semi-intelligent species and, generally unseen, for reasons that made sense only to someone as deranged and illogical as human, they helped. The work was slow. It took longer to bring the most advanced race they'd come across to spaceflight than it had taken man to go from hunter-gatherer to space wanderer. But it was still quicker than anything else they could come up with. And by doing this themselves, they knew exactly who it was that they were going to meet very soon. They knew of the culture, language, ideas, science, and personalities of the infant race they had, secretly, raised from limited cognition to spaceflight, and they rejoiced. Their new friends, a species that named themselves the Turashan, celebrated their new friends in the universe, and were not shown of the human's hand in their own elevation until they had nearly discovered the interference themselves. Then, realizing there was nothing much to be angry about, even if it was a bit uncomfortable to consider, they joined the humans in their search and guidance, looking for other races. Generally, there was a long wait before they found a new companion amongst the stars. Most of the life they came across was still single-celled, or proto-cells, and the sheer amount of time needed to raise such a species up was too much even for them. More than that, at a whim, they had to ask themselves, are you stepping in to help life form grow? And at what point are you creating it if you start so early in their evolutionary development? No. It was simpler to wait until they found species like the Turoshan had been somewhat intelligent, at least basically sapient, and helping from there. The Turoshan, too, agreed to help out, only from the shadows. The dark, guiding the new races carefully without revealing their hand in the development, so as to allow them to develop on their own, instead of in worship or mimicry of those who had raised them up. And thus was the Pragrasha people brought into the still very, very tiny fold of intelligent spacefaring life in the universe, along with the still questing, still searching humanity. Though there was very little left in the universe, their autonomous ships had not, by now, at least traveled near enough to inspect at long range for advanced alien life. And thus did time pass. While only 8 species had managed the incredible task of faster-than-light space flight on their own, humanity increased the number of species who were capable of it, even if only with their assistance, a great many times over. 1 living species had become 2, which became 3, and so forth. It took time. Time, the universe's greatest weapon against the upstart lifeforms who had the audacity to break its rules, continued for a long, long while. It marched steadily forward, a few races dying out due to their own desires, or a few seemingly unavoidable catastrophes, but far, far more being brought from relative savagery to complex cultures and intelligence. And humanity, with their new universal companions, continued their work. Which is how, when the universe was now 13.984 billion years old, and the 9th species to discover FTL travel on their own joined the stars in the far-flung ranges of space, they were not alone, as all of those who had come before had been. Instead, this new species of void wanderers sent out a questioning beacon to the endless reaches of space, doubting anything but microwave interference and emptiness might return back to them. They were pleasantly surprised. In response to their signal sent out to all the stars they could spot in the sky, asking for confirmation that they were not alone, they received a barrage of messages, echoed hundreds, perhaps thousands of times over from everywhere around them, from as many species as they had dared to dream of, from 1,000 galaxies, some with only 1 species, a few with multiple. They received a welcoming cheer of greeting from the populated universe, full of life. Then, when the barrage of greeting messages died down, and they stared awestruck into the inky void of endless space before them, a single message reached through from technology now so advanced it could be read by their instruments as if it were being spoken in a radio, translated perfectly for them to hear and understand. "Welcome, new friends to the universe," humanity sent them, by way of greeting. "Sorry if it's a little crowded. We got a bit impatient." End of story. I would like to thank our T5 members and patrons, Casper Arnholtz, John Creighton, Vidmori, 050, Dragzoon WRE, and Elijah Silvercross. Thank you very much.